My name is Knightley. I have spent most of my life studying wars not to glorify them, but to understand how machines, decisions, and human fear reshape the world. Historians like Sir Max Hastings once said that the real story of war begins after the last shot is fired, and few weapons prove that idea more clearly than the Panzerfaust 100 and 150. Military historian Stephen Zaloga described the Panzerfaust as one of the most dangerous infantry anti-tank weapons ever fielded in World War II. Veterans who faced it remembered not its size, but its suddenness. One moment, a tank rolled forward. The next, it was burning. But what happened after the war? When Germany collapsed, when Berlin fell, when factories went silent, did these weapons simply disappear? Were they destroyed, hidden, studied, reused? Did the Panzerfaust die with the Third Reich, or did it quietly shape the Cold War world we live in today? Tonight, we are not talking about battlefield glory. We are talking about aftermath, about abandoned weapons in forests, about engineers dismantling captured technology in secrecy, about relics melted into railways or locked away behind museum glass. The Panzerfaust 100-150 was never meant to survive history. It was built for desperation, for a collapsing empire fighting armored giants with handheld fire. So why do its echoes still exist? Where did they all go? And what did they leave behind? Join me nightly as we trace the forgotten afterlife of Germany's secret super anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust 100 and Panzerfaust 150. The rise and legacy of Panzerfaust 100-150 before the war ended, the birth of a legend. Before we can understand what happened to the Panzerfaust after World War II, we must confront a hard truth. This weapon was not born from confidence or superiority. It was born from fear. By 1942-1943, Germany was losing its armored advantage. On the Eastern Front, Soviet T-34s appeared in overwhelming numbers. In the West, American and British tanks rolled forward, backed by air power and industrial scale Germany could no longer match. Traditional German anti-tank guns were effective but heavy, slow, expensive, and increasingly vulnerable to air attack. The German solution was brutal in its simplicity. The Panzerfaust was designed to give ordinary infantry the power to kill a tank with a single shot. No tripod, no complex sighting system, no long training cycle. It was a disposable steel tube, a shaped charge warhead, and a crude firing mechanism. The early Panzerfaust models were short-ranged and dangerous to use, but as the war dragged on, Germany refined the concept. This led to the Panzerfaust 100 and later the Panzerfaust 150, which represented the peak of the design. The Panzerfaust 100 extended effective range to roughly 100 meters still short, but survivable in urban or forest combat. The Panzerfaust 150 improved penetration, flight stability, and introduced a limited reusability concept, an attempt to stretch dwindling resources. Its purpose was clear: stop Allied tanks at any cost. Politically and militarily, the Panzerfaust reflected the mindset of a nation fighting a defensive war it was already losing. Germany no longer planned for victory, it planned for resistance, engineering strengths and weaknesses. The Panzerfaust's greatest strength was its shaped charge warhead. Regardless of velocity, the chemical energy of the shaped charge allowed it to penetrate heavy armor. At close range, it could destroy nearly any Allied tank in service. Other strengths included extremely low production cost, minimal training requirements, massive production scalability, psychological deterrence against armored advances. But the weaknesses were just as severe. Very short engagement range, large backblast that exposed the shooter, single-use design or limited reuse in later models, high casualty risk for the operator. The Panzerfaust did not make infantry safer, it made them deadlier. This was not a soldier's weapon, it was a last resort weapon, the environment that created it. The Panzerfaust thrived in chaos. Urban ruins, forests, narrow roads, and rubble-filled cities became perfect killing grounds. Tanks lost visibility. Infantry escorts struggled to cover every angle. A single soldier hiding behind a wall could decide the fate of a column. By late 1944, Germany issued Panzerfausts not only to regular army units, but to Volksgrenadier divisions, Hitler Youth units, Volkssturm militias. Teenagers and elderly men were handed these weapons with minimal instruction. This alone tells us everything about the state of the war. First, combat deployments. On the Eastern Front, Soviet tank crews learned quickly to fear close terrain. Reports describe tanks advancing confidently, only to erupt in fire from unseen angles. Unlike anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams left little warning. No muzzle flash, no long engagement. German soldiers reacted with mixed emotions. Some felt empowered. Others knew that using the weapon often meant exposing themselves to machine gun fire immediately afterward. Allied forces adapted. Tanks advanced with heavier infantry screens. Suppressive fire increased. Urban assaults slowed dramatically. Still, the psychological damage was done. Tank crews knew that any shadow could kill them. Peak influence and iconic status. By the final year of the war, the Panzerfaust had become one of the most recognizable weapons on the battlefield. Not because it turned the tide, but because it represented a terrifying truth. Armor was no longer invincible. Millions of Panzerfausts were produced. They appeared in propaganda posters, training manuals, and desperate last-stand defenses from Normandy to Berlin. The Panzerfaust 100 and 150 symbolized the collapse of maneuver warfare, the rise of infantry-centric anti-armor tactics, the shift toward asymmetrical battlefield thinking. It was a weapon that rewarded ambush, patience, and proximity values that would dominate post-war conflicts. The strategic shift as defeat approached. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, the role of the Panzerfaust changed. Early in the war, it was a tactical tool. By the end, it was symbolic. Factories were bombed, raw materials ran out, ammunition quality declined, training collapsed. Yet Panzerfausts continued to be issued, not because they would win, but because they delayed. They bought time. They inflicted fear. They slowed advances street by street. In the ruins of Berlin, Panzerfaust teams stalked Allied armor among shattered buildings. Tanks still fell, but the war was already lost. Legacy. Before the silence. When the final shots were fired, the Panzerfaust had achieved something rare. It did not win wars, it did not save Germany, but it permanently changed military thinking. For the first time, a mass-produced infantry weapon proved that cheap technology could destroy expensive machines. This lesson would not be forgotten. And then the war ended. The factories stopped. The armies surrendered. The battlefield went silent. But the story of the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 had only just begun. The war ends. The fate of Panzerfaust 100-150 begins chaos of surrender and seizure. The end of World War II was not a clean break. There was no moment when the weapons simply stopped existing. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Panzerfaust did not vanish. It remained everywhere, lying, stacked, hidden, forgotten. Allied troops advancing through Germany, Austria, and occupied territories reported Panzerfausts. Leaning against walls in abandoned houses, buried in forest caches, stacked in railway depots and factories, floating in flooded trenches and canals, hidden inside civilian basements. Some were still sealed in crates, others were half-burned from bombing raids. Many were still live. In Berlin alone, thousands of Panzerfausts were left scattered among the ruins. Entire Volkssturm units had collapsed overnight, leaving their weapons behind without firing a single shot. For Allied soldiers, this created a new danger. The war was over, but the battlefield was still armed. Unexploded Panzerfausts became silent hazards. Engineers and ordnance disposal teams were suddenly as essential as combat troops. Immediate Allied reactions. The victorious powers had no unified plan. The official stance was clear: destroy enemy weapons. But reality was more complicated. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France all recognized that the Panzerfaust represented something new. It was not just a German weapon, it was a concept. Orders varied by region. Some commanders ordered immediate destruction, others allowed temporary storage. Some quietly diverted intact examples to technical units. In the confusion of occupation, Decisions were often made by officers on the ground. A crate destroyed in one town might be shipped to a research facility in another. The power vacuum. With Germany defeated, a new struggle began, not on battlefields, but in laboratories. The question was no longer how to stop German tanks. It was, what can we learn from this? Every major Allied power faced the same dilemma: scrap everything and move on, or extract value from the enemy's desperation. The Panzerfaust sat at the center of that dilemma. It was cheap, it was effective, and it worked. This made it dangerous in a different way. If such a simple weapon could defeat heavy armor, then future wars would not be dominated solely by tanks. The technology race begins. Captured Panzerfaust. 100 and 150 units were shipped to proving grounds, ordnance labs, infantry training schools. Engineers dismantled them piece by piece. They studied shaped charge geometry, fuse reliability, propellant efficiency, infantry ergonomics. The weapon's simplicity shocked many analysts. There was nothing elegant about it. No precision engineering, no luxury. Yet it worked. This forced a shift in thinking. Military planners realized that cost-effective asymmetry could rival industrial superiority. The Panzerfaust was no longer a weapon. It was a lesson. Allied rivalries emerge. Almost immediately, rivalry appeared. The United States and the Soviet Union both collected German technology aggressively. While rocket programs like V2 gained fame, infantry weapons like the Panzerfaust moved quietly without headlines. The Soviets, in particular, were deeply interested. Their battlefield experience had already shown the value of close-range anti-tank weapons in urban combat. British and French analysts also evaluated the Panzerfaust, but with more caution. They saw its power but also its risks. No one wanted civilians or irregular forces armed with such tools in peacetime Europe. Destruction, storage, and silence. By late 1945, large-scale destruction began. Entire stockpiles of Panzerfausts were burned, blown up, crushed, dumped into rivers or pits. Metal was desperately needed for reconstruction. A disposable weapon had no political future. But destruction was not total. Some Panzerfausts were deliberately preserved. For training manuals, for weapons museums, for classified research, others simply slipped through the cracks, stored in forgotten warehouses, buried and recorded poorly, lost in transit, from weapon to artifact. Within months, the Panzerfaust transitioned from battlefield threat to historical object. What had once been issued to teenagers in desperation was now tagged, catalogued, and labeled. Yet the irony remained. This weapon created to fight tanks in the streets of Berlin was now shaping the next war, not the last one. It influenced how armies thought about infantry anti-armor roles, urban warfare, psychological deterrence. The war had ended. The factories were silent. But the fate of the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 was no longer tied to Germany. It belonged to the world now. And in the shadows of occupation, its true afterlife had just begun. Where did they all go? When the war ended, the Panzerfaust did not receive a single ending. There was no final battlefield, no ceremonial destruction, no clear closing chapter. Instead, the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 fractured into many destinies, each shaped by necessity, secrecy, and forgetfulness. To understand what truly happened, we must follow every path. Scrapped for resources. The most common fate of the Panzerfaust was also the least dramatic. It was melted down. Post-war Europe was starved for raw materials. Cities lay in ruins. Railways were twisted wrecks. Factories had been bombed into silence. Steel mattered more than history. The Panzerfaust was perfect scrap. Thin steel tube, minimal moving parts, no long-term military value. Millions of units, especially Panzerfaust 60 and 100 models, were collected and destroyed within months. Occupation authorities organized massive recycling programs. Trucks carried captured weapons to scrapyards. Entire depots vanished overnight. The irony was cruel. Weapons built to destroy tanks were reborn as railway rails, construction beams, farming tools, industrial machinery parts. For most Panzerfausts, 1945 was the end. They did not become relics. They became infrastructure, captured by major Allied powers. Not all Panzerfausts were destroyed. The most intact examples were quietly selected, documented, and shipped away. United States, the U.S. Army evaluated the Panzerfaust for infantry training, comparative testing, ordnance analysis. American engineers focused on the shaped charge effect and ease of use. While the U.S. already had the bazooka, the Panzerfaust's simplicity and disposable concept influenced later thinking about lightweight infantry anti-armor weapons. Most U.S.-captured Panzerfausts were eventually destroyed, but not before their data was absorbed. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union took the Panzerfaust very seriously. Red Army engineers studied captured stockpiles extensively. The idea that a single soldier could destroy a tank at close range fits Soviet urban warfare doctrine perfectly. Many historians consider the Panzerfaust a direct conceptual ancestor of later Soviet RPG designs. Thousands of units were examined. Some were reused for training. Others disappeared into classified research facilities. United Kingdom and France, British and French forces evaluated the Panzerfaust more cautiously. They recognized its battlefield power, but also its risks, particularly its potential misuse by irregular forces or resistance groups. Most were destroyed after limited study. A small number were preserved for reference. Other nations, smaller Allied and occupied nations, also acquired Panzerfausts. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, China. Some used them briefly in post-war security roles. Others simply dismantled them. The weapons spread but never officially returned to frontline service, secret programs and quiet experiments. Some Panzerfausts did not go to scrapyards or museums. They went somewhere else, closed test ranges, classified proving grounds, facilities without public records. In the early Cold War, enemy technology was currency. The Panzerfaust's influence extended beyond physical examples. Engineers experimented with improved shaped charges, safer backblast designs, reusable launch systems, better sights and ergonomics. These experiments rarely mentioned the Panzerfaust by name, but its DNA was unmistakable. What disappeared was not the weapon, but its identity. The Panzerfaust became the idea that infantry could always threaten armor. Museum preservation, only a tiny fraction survived intact into peacetime. Museums acquired Panzerfausts through military donations, captured equipment collections, battlefield recovery efforts. Preserving them was difficult. They were disposable weapons, never meant to last decades. Thin metal corroded quickly, original paint flaked, internal components degraded. Some museums chose not to restore them fully. They left them rusted, scarred, broken, because that was the truth of the weapon. It was not a masterpiece of engineering, it was a product of collapse. Battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Even today, Panzerfaust remnants still surface. In forests, hikers occasionally find rusted tubes, corroded warhead fragments. In Eastern Europe, farmers uncover buried caches during ploughing. In waterways and canals, divers encounter crates dumped hastily in 1945. These finds are dangerous. Some warheads remain live. Explosive ordnance disposal teams still respond to discoveries decades later. These are not museum pieces. They are unresolved remnants of war, private collections and the black market. A small number of Panzerfausts escaped official control. Soldiers brought them home as souvenirs. Resistance fighters hid them. Civilians stored them out of fear or curiosity. Over time, most were destroyed for safety reasons, but a few survived in private hands, deactivated, cut open, rendered inert. These examples are rare, valuable, heavily regulated, and often surrounded by questionable stories. The vanishing majority. The most important truth is this: most Panzerfausts did not survive long enough to be remembered. They were destroyed quickly, recycled without records, lost in bureaucratic chaos. Unlike tanks or aircraft, the Panzerfaust left no large wrecks, no dramatic graveyards. Its disappearance was silent. A weapon without a single ending. The story of where they all went is not simple. The Panzerfaust was melted, studied, hidden, displayed, abandoned. No single ending exists. Instead, like the war that created it, the Panzerfaust splintered into many paths, each shaping the future in a different way. And by the time the world noticed what it had truly taught, the weapon itself was already gone. Impact on the post-war world. When the last Panzerfausts were destroyed, scrapped, or locked away, their physical presence faded quickly. But their impact did not. The Panzerfaust 100 and 150 left no armies behind, no successor units, no national doctrine bearing their name. Instead, they left something far more enduring, a shift in how wars would be fought, influence on new military technology. The most direct legacy of the Panzerfaust was technological, but not in the way most people expect. It did not inspire heavier tanks or thicker armor. It inspired portability. Military planners across the world absorbed a brutal lesson. A single infantryman, armed with a cheap disposable weapon, could destroy a machine that took months to build. This idea reshaped post-war military thinking, shaped charge proliferation. The Panzerfaust demonstrated the battlefield potential of shaped charges at infantry scale. After the war, nearly every major military power invested heavily in improving penetration efficiency, standoff distance, fuse reliability. These improvements became foundational to Cold War anti-tank weapons, infantry-centered anti-armor doctrine. Before the Panzerfaust, anti-tank warfare was dominated by artillery, towed guns, tank destroyers. After the war, infantry became central to the anti-armor equation. Close-range ambush tactics, urban defense, and decentralized firepower gained legitimacy. The Panzerfaust validated the idea that armor could never operate alone. Disposable versus reusable weapons. The Panzerfaust also sparked debate. Disposable weapons were cheap and fast, but wasteful. Reusable launchers required training and logistics. Cold War militaries experimented with both approaches, ultimately combining the lessons into hybrid systems. The Panzerfaust was not copied directly, but its logic was influence on NATO and Warsaw Pact thinking. The ideological divide of the Cold War shaped how the Panzerfaust's lessons were interpreted. Warsaw Pact perspective. Eastern Bloc doctrine emphasized mass infantry formations and urban combat scenarios. The Panzerfaust fit this worldview perfectly. The idea that lightly equipped soldiers could threaten armored breakthroughs became a cornerstone of defensive planning. Close-range anti-tank weapons were no longer seen as emergency tools, they were standard equipment. NATO perspective. Western planners took a different lesson. They focused on combined arms integration, infantry screening, air superiority, reconnaissance. The Panzerfaust reinforced the necessity of protecting armor from close-range threats. In both blocks, the result was the same. Tanks could no longer dominate alone. Psychological impact on veterans. For those who faced the Panzerfaust, its legacy was deeply personal. Tank crews remembered the fear not of long-range guns, but of sudden, unseen destruction. Infantry veterans remembered the weapon as a gamble. One shot, one chance, survival never guaranteed. After the war, these memories shaped training manuals, battlefield caution, and operational doctrine. The Panzerfaust haunted soldiers long after it disappeared from arsenals. Cultural and media influence. The Panzerfaust's image survived where the weapon did not. Books, war films, and later documentaries portrayed it as a symbol of last-ditch resistance, a weapon of urban ruins, a tool of desperate defenders. Its silhouette became shorthand for asymmetric power. In modern video games and popular media, the Panzerfaust is often exaggerated, but the core idea remains. The smallest soldier can destroy the biggest machine. This mythos began in 1944 and never truly ended. Political and diplomatic effects. After the war, defeated nations faced a dilemma: what to do with the symbols of their destruction. For Germany, the Panzerfaust was not celebrated. It was buried literally and figuratively. It represented collapse, not triumph. For the victors, it became a quiet propaganda tool. The message was simple. Enemy technology could be neutralized, studied, repurposed. The Panzerfaust became proof that victory was not just about numbers, but about adaptation. A weapon that changed the balance. Perhaps the most important impact of the Panzerfaust lies in this. It proved that technological asymmetry could challenge industrial superiority. That lesson traveled far beyond Europe. Post-war insurgencies, liberation movements, and irregular forces absorbed the same idea. Cheap weapons, close-range tactics, psychological shock. The Panzerfaust did not create modern asymmetric warfare, but it accelerated it. Legacy without a flag. The Panzerfaust did not survive as a national weapon. It survived as a concept. No parade honored it. No doctrine named it. No army claimed it proudly. Yet its influence reached nearly every modern battlefield. It changed how infantry fought. It changed how tanks advanced. It changed how commanders planned. The war had ended, but the presence of the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 lingered, shaping minds long after its steel tubes were gone. The final survivors. By the time the Cold War took shape, the Panzerfaust was already disappearing from memory. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was never meant to last. Unlike tanks or aircraft preserved in vast numbers, the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 were disposable weapons. Their survival into the modern era is the exception, not the rule. What remains today is fragmentary, scattered and incomplete. Catalogue of remaining units. The number of surviving Panzerfaust 100 and 150 units is small. Most are found in 3 places: museums. A handful of military museums across Europe and North America hold original Panzerfausts, often deactivated, frequently incomplete, sometimes reconstructed from multiple examples. These museum pieces are rarely pristine. Many show corrosion, missing components, or post-war handling damage. Curators face a dilemma: restore them to how they once looked, or leave them as decaying artifacts that reflect their true nature. Some choose restoration, others choose honesty. Private collections. A very limited number exist in private hands. These examples are fully deactivated, legally registered, often cut open to prove inert status. Collectors value them not for aesthetics, but for historical rarity. Ownership is heavily regulated, and documentation is often incomplete. Many examples lack clear provenance, making authentication difficult. Derelict relics. Some Panzerfaust remnants were never collected. They exist as rusted tubes in forests, corroded fragments in abandoned bunkers, warheads buried deep underground. These are not collectible items. They are unexploded ordnance risks and are usually destroyed once discovered. Restored and displayed examples. Very few Panzerfausts have been restored to near-original condition. Restoration is challenging. Original materials degrade rapidly. Replacement parts are nearly impossible to source. Safety concerns limit handling. Some museums have restored examples for static display only, ensuring they can never be fired or loaded. No known fully functional Panzerfaust 100 or 150 remains in legal operation. The weapon exists only as a silent object now. The value of survivors today. The value of surviving Panzerfausts is not measured in firepower, it is measured in meaning. Historical value. These weapons represent a turning point in warfare. The rise of infantry anti-armor dominance, the collapse of industrial-scale certainty, the shift toward asymmetric conflict. They are studied by historians as symbols of desperation and innovation colliding. Monetary value. When legally transferable components appear at auctions, prices can be high. But complete examples almost never change hands publicly. Their rarity, legal complexity, and safety concerns make them more museum artifacts than collectibles. Research value military historians and engineers still study Panzerfaust designs to understand shaped charge evolution, emergency weapon production, human factors in extreme combat conditions. They are case studies, not templates. The mystery of the missing units. Despite extensive post-war cleanup, not every Panzerfaust was accounted for. Rumors persist, stories of buried caches, forgotten warehouses, lost shipments misfiled in occupation records. Some archives remain classified, Others were destroyed during Cold War secrecy purges. It is entirely possible that intact Panzerfausts still exist, sealed, buried, or forgotten. But time is not kind to thin steel and unstable explosives. If they remain, they are dangerous. Why so few survived? The reason is simple. The Panzerfaust was never designed to be preserved. It was cheap, disposable, tactical. It represented urgency, not legacy. Once its lesson was learned, the weapon itself became irrelevant. Relics without glory. The surviving Panzerfausts do not inspire awe like tanks or aircraft. They inspire discomfort. They remind us that war is not always fought by elites or professionals, but by civilians handed a weapon and a few minutes of instruction. They are artifacts of collapse, not triumph. A quiet end. The final survivors of the Panzerfaust do not roar, fire, or move. They sit behind glass. They rust in the soil. They sleep underwater, silent. And in that silence, they tell the final truth of the weapon. It was never meant to survive history. Conclusion. War machines are built to destroy. They are designed with a single purpose: to end lives, break defenses, and force outcomes through violence. But when the guns fall silent, those machines are left behind. And in their remains we often find the most honest stories of all. The Panzerfaust 100 and 150 were never symbols of victory. They were not marvels of engineering meant to inspire awe. They were born in the final, desperate phase of a collapsing war effort, when time was gone, resources were exhausted, and hope had narrowed to survival measured in meters. Yet despite that, their story did not end in 1945, because history is not defined only by what wins, but by what changes the rules. The Panzerfaust changed the rules. The aftermath matters more than the battle. When Germany surrendered, millions of Panzerfausts lay scattered across Europe. They did not march in victory parades. They were not proudly preserved by a defeated nation. They were burned, crushed, melted, buried. And yet, even as their physical forms disappeared, their idea spread. That idea was simple and terrifying. A single infantryman, armed with a cheap weapon, could destroy the most expensive machine on the battlefield. This truth unsettled military planners across the world. It meant that industrial dominance no longer guaranteed battlefield dominance. It meant that armor required protection. It meant that modern warfare would never again be purely mechanical. The Panzerfaust did not need to survive to be remembered. Its lesson embedded itself into doctrine, design, and fear. A weapon of desperation, not glory. It is important to say this clearly. The Panzerfaust was not a heroic weapon. It was issued to teenagers, to old men, to civilians pressed into service. Its use often meant exposure, injury, or death for the operator. It offered power, but no safety. That reality matters, because when we look at surviving Panzerfausts in museums today, we are not looking at triumph, we are looking at collapse. They represent the moment when a nation could no longer rely on tanks, aircraft, or strategy, and instead placed its faith in one-shot solutions and human sacrifice. This is why Germany never celebrated the Panzerfaust after the war. There was nothing to celebrate. The Cold War inheritance. The true heirs of the Panzerfaust were not German soldiers. They were engineers, planners, strategists. In laboratories and proving grounds, the Panzerfaust was dismantled, measured, and understood. Not copied directly, but translated. Its DNA appeared in infantry anti-tank doctrine, shaped charge development, urban warfare planning. It became part of the Cold War's silent foundation. Tanks still ruled but cautiously. Infantry still advanced but empowered. The Panzerfaust had proven that asymmetry was not a weakness, it was a strategy. What survives and why it matters today, only fragments remain. A rusted tube behind glass, a corroded warhead in the soil, a deactivated relic in a private collection. These objects are not impressive. They do not dominate rooms like tanks or aircraft, but they carry weight. Because they remind us that warfare is not only shaped by brilliance or innovation, but by fear, urgency, and improvisation. The Panzerfaust tells us what happens when a war reaches its breaking point. As I walk through museums, abandoned bunkers, and forgotten roads, I am always drawn to the smallest objects. Not the massive machines, but the simple tools. Because they often tell the hardest truths. The Panzerfaust was small, crude, disposable, and yet it reshaped modern warfare more quietly than many celebrated weapons ever did. That is why I tell these stories. Not to admire destruction, but to understand it. Every relic has a voice, every wreck has a history. Every machine, no matter how destructive, teaches us something about who we were and who we have become. A world still living with the lesson. Even today, the lesson of the Panzerfaust remains relevant. Modern battlefields are filled with advanced machines, but they are still vulnerable. Technology evolves, armor thickens, sensors improve. But the core truth remains unchanged. Power does not always belong to the largest force. The Panzerfaust proved that once, and the world never forgot. The story of the Panzerfaust 100 and 150 does not end with destruction or preservation. It ends with understanding. Understanding how desperation breeds innovation. Understanding how simple ideas can outlast complex machines. Understanding how war leaves echoes long after its noise fades. The Panzerfaust did not survive as a weapon. It survived as a warning. If you want to continue this journey with me through forgotten bunkers, lost prototypes, and the silent bones of history, join me. There are countless echoes of war left to explore, each one waiting to be heard. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And now I leave the final question to you. What story should we uncover next? Let me know in the comments below.